Today we are going to discuss this fascinating painting by El Greco called The Disrobing of Christ. Shortly after El Greco arrived in Toledo in 1577, he received two important commissions: the decoration of the altarpiece in the church of the convent of Santo Domingo en Antiguo, for which he created the Trinity, and the spoliation for the Toledo Cathedral. It is strange to consider that a recently arrived artist obtained commissions of such a level. In his favor, we could say that the dean of the Cathedral of Toledo, Don Diego de Castilla, had a son that Domenicus had known during the years that he spent in Rome. This is one of the most powerful paintings by El Greco. The Disrobing of Christ was destined for the dressing room of the sacristy in the cathedral. That's a place used to get dressed and undressed before Mass, so the stripping of Jesus' garment obtained a great symbolic value. This subject is somewhat strange in the Western iconography, and it is a reason why the Cretan master took different biblical stories so that they could serve him as inspiration. This specific evangelical passage corresponds to the Passion, in which a person that we have in green here on the right prepares to tear off the robe of Christ for the expectation of the crowd. Next to him, at the bottom of the canvas, are the three Marys, who watch there is man preparing the cross. Finally, and in a prominent space on the left, there is a soldier dressed in the fashion of the 16th century, who is looking at the viewer. This way, this work becomes more relatable to the audience, as well as the man that we have at the back that is also looking at us. This work is so important and powerful that even his son, Jorge Manuel, made a copy of it. This is actually the only signed copy by his son. So you had to answer some questions on CLM Virtual and get ready to prepare at some point a work analysis. Okay, so let's see a couple of things that are important about this painting. What's the story depicted here? The theme belongs to the apocryphal Gospels. It is not, as we said, one of the most common themes within Christian imagery. This is the moment where the Passion of Jesus Christ, where his clothes are about to be removed. The figure of Jesus is also perfectly distinguished from the rest of the characters in this painting because of the bright red garment in which he has been represented, a symbol of the Passion of Christ, but also of the blood that is going to be spilled. Jesus seems to be on a different psychological plane when he is compared to the rest of the people of the composition. He appears looking at the sky with a serene gesture and almost a halo of light that seems to be open at the top of the canvas, so that it gives us the impression that he is connected directly with God. Christ is also surrounded by many people who have been painted in dirtier, kind of muddier and darker colors, also pretending to be a contrast between the religious ecstasy of Jesus and the harshness of the environment. How is this painting distributed? The painting actually focuses on the figure of Christ that occupies the central and most important area, and it is reinforced by the strong red color that creates this oval shape that is repeated again in the rest of the figures that surround it. This creates a rare symmetrical composition in which the vertical lines predominate. This is all topped by the forest of lances that extend beyond the canvas. What is again this painting's composition? Have you think about it? Is this triangular? Is this circular? It's actually oval. Okay? However, color predominates over lines through the use of, for example, loose brushstrokes. And as for the colors, the warm and bold red of the garment used for Christ stands out especially, attracting with intensity the gaze of the spectator, the viewer. In contrast, which is a typical mannerist technique to create tension, this red is surrounded by cold and generally acid colors. For example, the combination of yellow and violet cloaks of the women or the man bending over the cross. Light is illuminating the whole scene, and especially the face of Christ, and generates strong chiaroscuro in some of the different characters, especially in the figures in the background. Going back to the oval shape, that may remind you of something we have seen before, and that comes from the Byzantine tradition, which is the use of the mandala. Is there anything worth mentioning about the crowd? If you look at them, they are all nervous and excited, but nobody's looking at him directly. Okay? What is this man in green doing? He's getting ready to get off the clothes of Jesus Christ. According to tradition, being exhausted, Christ would have been dragged in the last section of the ascent to the Calvary. Then the man wearing the hat, what is he doing? He's pointing at us. He's making us all feel guilty. It's shame on you. Look what you have done. Then the man with the armor can be either Pontius Pilate or the good centurion, who converted right before he hit the side of Christ with a spear. It is also a representation of the 16th century. The extraordinary handling of the texture by El Greco is achieved in its maximum expression with the brightness and reflections that are made on the soldier's armor. Look at that. What is this other man doing here? He's bending over to get the cross ready, and it's the only sign basically that tells us that he is about to be crucified. In the left foreground, the three Marys contemplate the scene with distress. The three Marys are known as Mary the Virgin, Mary of Cleophas, but it's a little bit unsure, and Mary Magdalene. In any case, they are always referred to as the three Marys. In this scene, Christ is looking up to heaven, and this spoliation is considered one of the most stunning depictions of Christ. The robe that Jesus is wearing is made with fairly synthetic folds, contrary to the detail that was so common during the Renaissance, and this highlights his expertise in the creation of texture. Amongst of all the figures, the expressive treatment of Christ stands out, who, with his hand on his chest as a sign of pain, his elevated gaze, observes the scene with a mixture of melancholy and resignation, again constructing with the theatrical gestures of the crowd around him. And again, this a typical mannerist technique. Check the intensity of the gaze. Christ's resignation is achieved by the painter with a technique that he learned from Tintoretto. What is this technique about? It's actually very simple. It's a quick brushstroke, very diluted in oil, using just white color that works as a glaze and blurs the gaze, giving it that melancholic and ecstatic character. Many painters will use it later, even the great Velázquez. So again, check the face of the Savior in contrast to the rest of the people. What about the use of nature in the painting? Space is extremely reduced due to the spatial stress of the entire canvas that drives us vertically, focusing on the oppression of the figure of Christ and making it a very human scene. In visual art, this is called horror vacui, a Latin term meaning fear of empty spaces, making reference to the feeling of the entire surface of a space of an artwork with many different details. So basically, this is the only natural space that we see in the painting. What about the painting techniques? The painter used chiaroscuro, especially in the contrast between the face of Jesus and the rest of the people around him, sfumato, in the blending of the different figures, mannerism in the dramatism of the scene, horror vacui, again, the feeling of the space, the connection with the viewer, connecting the audience with the painting, and the use of linear perspective, but with a twist that we will discuss in a minute. Along with what we already said, El Greco's painting owes much to his Byzantine training as an icon painter. He worked there alongside his father, and it's not really a technical influence, it's more a perception of the idea of painting. El Greco, from his Byzantine tradition, understands painting as a form of spirituality that, instead of representing the visible world, tries to teach us religious emotions. That is why he renounces to naturalism and, together with his brilliant use of color, tries to provoke moods and religious feelings impossible to explain in a realistic kind of way. In this way, he approaches the mystique essence that was so strong precisely in the city of Toledo and brings him closer to the contemporary world. Also, from Byzantine tradition is the fact that the figure of Jesus Christ has been represented in a monumental type of way, the bulky folding, the sculptural appearance, and the use of the secondary figures around him. However, he also employs influences from the Venetian type of school, the color and drama of the images, which is undoubtedly the seal of Tintoretto. But the painter had also been a disciple of Titian, so he collects several influences from this school. Precisely, the study of color is perfect. It uses the red tint of the robe to attract attention, and to balance it, he uses different positions of light, where, for example, the reflection of the garment are clearly visible in the armor. His technique, using loose brushstrokes that, by blurring the edges, achieves a better integration between the background and the figures, or the interesting textures, make this painting unique in all senses. About his Roman influence, we have the sculptural breadth of the figures, marking their anatomy very visible in, for example, the man bending over, even the feet of Christ. They are very strong type of feet, some of the figures behind him, the crowd in general. And finally, he also employs mannerist elements in the character from behind or the compositional organization. His mannerism is also visible in the acid and glowing colors, the expressive use of light, the double point of view combined with the vertical perspective, and basically all he wanted to do was to break with the harmony and classical canons that he had assimilated during his stay in Rome. What about his symbolism? This work is full of symbolism. He concentrated all the expressive force of his art, and there is like this kind of majestic choreography, and the idea was to represent the martyrdom of Christ. But he's not focusing in the intensity of the disrobing, but more in the minutes before the last moment, the stupor, the emptiness, the overwhelming gestures. All these that mark the beginning of this ritual of death. So by making this composition vertically, he wants to show the oppression of Christ by his tormentors. He He also uses, as we mentioned before, different use of perspective, because if you look at the painting, there is a double point of view. Again, typical of mannerism, because while Christ is seen from a low point, and that's why we see his figure enlarged, the three Marys and the man on the cross are viewed from almost top to bottom, creating this unnatural tension. Also important, the concentration of the figure of Christ dominating everything, the realism of characters, making this whole painting a very human type of scene, and the fact that this is a very Spanish type of painting. We can even say it's the anticipation of the Velázquez's style. But what was wrong with this painting? What caused him trouble with the church? First, the placement of the tormentors. Second, the presence of the women. And third, the man with the armor. But there is more, okay? Because the council and the dean complained also that the abundance of figures detracted from Christ. And they also complained that the episode that GRECO had wanted to represent was not among those described in the canonical Gospels. So the idea was that the scenes in the painting were intended to be known parts of the history of Christianity, so that parishioners, upon entering the church and contemplating them, would learn immediately about Catholic religion. This dispute lasted throughout the whole process, and it cost El Greco a lot of money. Because since El Greco was forced to have recourse to legal arbitration and eventually received only 350 ducats, when he originally should have had 950. He was also supposed to remove some of the figures, but as you can see, he never did. Okay, so even just as a fun fact, they offer him as a payment for the work more for the frame containing the painting than for the painting itself. And this way they showed the artist his disregard for his art. So this dispute meant that El Greco would never work for the church again. This is a place where you can currently see this painting. You may remember if you visited Toledo at some point during your stay in Granada. And all in all, El Greco is considered to have been one of the first ones to present unnatural and subjective features out of place in his time, and adopted more abstract and intellectual approaches. This allowed him to give a personal version of the different religious scenes that he portrayed. Precisely, and after several centuries of oblivion and even devaluation, his painting was rediscovered during the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century by Expressionist painters. Even the great Velázquez, a century later during the 17th century, will take some of his ideas and adapted them to the Baroque type of taste. For example, we can see the use of the spears and their arrangement in the representation of Velázquez of the Surrender of Breda. So, this is the end from me, and thank you very much.